On March 7, 1900, the largest British military force ever assembled in South Africa, over 40,000 men, supported by massive artillery and commanded by the Empire's most celebrated general, advanced against a Boer defensive position near a farm called Poplar Grove. The British had overwhelming numerical superiority, complete control of the initiative, and every advantage that modern military science could provide. By the end of the day, the entire Boer force of approximately 6,000 men had escaped without significant loss, slipping away from what should have been a devastating encirclement, as if the British army simply didn't exist. Not a single senior Boer commander was captured. The trap that was supposed to end the war, instead, caught nothing but empty farmland and a few abandoned wagons. The Battle of Poplar Grove would become the most embarrassing non-defeat in British military history, a fiasco so complete that it made victories look like failures and transformed tactical success into strategic humiliation. This is the story of how the British Empire's mightiest army executed a textbook operation perfectly and still managed to let the enemy walk away, exposing the fundamental dysfunction that plagued British command throughout the Boer War. To understand how such an absurd situation developed, we must examine the strategic context of early March 1900 and the transformation that had overtaken British fortunes in South Africa. Just weeks earlier, the war had seemed on the verge of becoming an imperial catastrophe. Black weeks, disasters, the siege of Ladysmith, the humiliation at Spion Kop, all of these had created a crisis of confidence that threatened the government itself. But in late February and early March, the situation had reversed dramatically with a speed that shocked both sides. The sieges of Kimberley and Ladysmith had been lifted. General Lord Roberts, brought out of retirement to salvage the South African campaign, had taken personal command and implemented a strategy of rapid maneuver that bypassed Boer defensive positions rather than battering against them frontally. Roberts was 73 years old, a tiny man barely over 5 feet tall, but he was a legendary figure in the Victorian Army, holder of the Victoria Cross, an architect of successful campaigns across the Empire. His chief of staff was General Lord Kitchener, equally famous and equally determined to redeem British military reputation through decisive victory. Roberts' strategy was built around mobility and overwhelming force, rather than allowing the Boers to dictate the terms of engagement from prepared defensive positions. Roberts would use his massive numerical superiority to outflank and envelop Boer forces, threatening their lines of retreat and forcing them to abandon positions or risk encirclement. It was sound military thinking that exploited British advantages while avoiding the suicidal frontal assaults that had characterized earlier operations. In theory, this approach would force the Boers into a decisive battle where British numbers would prove overwhelming. In practice, it required coordination, speed, and aggressive execution, qualities that would prove surprisingly difficult for the British command structure to deliver. By early March, Roberts had maneuvered his massive army to within striking distance of Bloemfontein, the capital of the Orange Free State. Blocking his path was a Boer defensive position anchored on a farm called Poplar Grove, situated along the Modder River. The Boer force here was commanded by some of their most capable leaders. Piet Crunch had recently surrendered after being trapped at Paardeberg, but Christian de Wet, one of the most brilliant guerrilla commanders the war would produce, was present, along with President Steyn of the Orange Free State and various commando leaders. The Boers had perhaps 6,000 fighters, a force utterly inadequate to resist Roberts' army in a conventional battle, but potentially sufficient to delay the British advance if properly positioned. The Boer position at Poplar Grove followed their typical defensive pattern: trenches dug along ridges with good fields of fire. Commandos dispersed to avoid presenting concentrated targets for artillery, and careful attention to lines of retreat. The Boers had learned through bitter experience that they could not hold fixed positions indefinitely against British numbers and firepower. Their strategy had evolved toward fighting delaying actions, inflicting casualties and slowing the British advance, while preserving their own forces to fight another day. This was sensible military practice for a numerically inferior force, but it meant the Boers were always prepared to withdraw rather than face encirclement or destruction. Roberts studied the Boer position and developed a plan that should have resulted in the war's most decisive victory. Rather than attacking the Boer trenches frontally, he would fix them in place with demonstrations and artillery bombardment, while sending massive flanking columns to envelop both Boer wings. The northern flank would be turned by General John French's cavalry division. Over 5,000 mounted troops who would sweep wide around the Boer left and cut the roads leading east toward Bloemfontein. The southern flank would be turned by General Thomas Kilkenny's division, another large force that would loop around the Boer right. Meanwhile, the centre would advance steadily, maintaining pressure and preventing the Boers from concentrating against either flanking column. On paper, it was an elegant plan that utilized British advantages perfectly. The Boers would be caught in a massive pincer movement, their retreat routes cut, their small force overwhelmed by converging columns, each larger than their entire army. If executed with even moderate efficiency, the operation would trap the entire Boer force and capture or destroy most of the fighting strength defending the Orange Free State. The war might effectively end with a single decisive engagement. Roberts was so confident of success that he made preparations for the rapid exploitation that would follow the Boer collapse, planning to push immediately toward Bloemfontein once the enemy at Poplar Grove was eliminated. The operation began before dawn on March 7th, with British forces moving into position. The sheer scale of the army Roberts had assembled was impressive even by European standards. Over 40,000 infantry, thousands of cavalry, and more than 100 artillery pieces began their coordinated advance across the veldt. This was the largest mobile force Britain had fielded since the Napoleonic Wars, a demonstration of imperial power that should have swept aside any opposition. Supply wagons and support units stretched for miles, and the dust raised by so many men and animals moving simultaneously was visible for vast distances. The initial movements went according to plan. British artillery opened a bombardment of the Boer positions at dawn, shells exploding along the trench lines with impressive precision. The Boers returned fire, but were clearly outmatched in artillery, and their small guns were gradually suppressed by the weight of British fire. In the centre, British infantry began advancing in extended order, using the tactics learned from earlier disasters to avoid presenting massed targets. The Boer riflemen engaged them at long range, but the British advance continued steadily, pushing forward through scattered fire. On the flanks, the great turning movements began. French's cavalry swept northward in a wide arc, moving rapidly across open country with minimal opposition. Kilkenny's infantry division marched southward, encountering only scattered Boer pickets that fell back without offering serious resistance. Everything was proceeding exactly as Roberts had envisioned. The Boers were being fixed in place by the frontal pressure, while massive forces maneuvered to cut off their retreat. By mid-morning, British staff officers were congratulating themselves on the smooth execution of a complex operation. What these officers failed to grasp was that the Boers had no intention of staying in place long enough to be trapped. Christian de Wet, observing the British movements from his command position, immediately recognized what Roberts was attempting. De Wet was perhaps the finest tactical commander the Boers produced during the war. A man with an intuitive grasp of battlefield dynamics and an absolute refusal to fight on unfavorable terms. He could see the British flanking columns moving into position, could calculate approximately when they would cut the roads to the east, and he knew with perfect clarity that remaining at Poplar Grove meant the destruction of his force. De Wet made his decision with the kind of clarity that separated great commanders from merely competent ones. The Boers would abandon their positions immediately and withdraw before the British trap could close. There would be no dramatic last stand, no heroic defense of prepared positions. The commando system allowed for this kind of flexibility in ways that conventional armies could not match. Boer fighters were not bound by rigid discipline or complex chains of command. When their leaders ordered withdrawal, they could mount their horses and move with a speed that conventional infantry could never match. The Boer withdrawal began around mid-morning, and it was executed with remarkable efficiency. Commandos in the trenches maintained steady fire to give the impression of continued resistance, while other units began moving eastward. The Boers were expert at this kind of fighting retreat, with rearguards covering the movement of the main body. Wagons loaded with supplies and ammunition were sent ahead, protected by mounted commandos who could fight if intercepted, but whose primary mission was preserving the Boers. Mobile logistical tale. Within hours, thousands of Boer fighters were streaming eastward along roads that should have been cut by French's flanking cavalry, but were still, incredibly, open. The British command structure took an astonishingly long time to recognize what was happening. Staff officers studying the battlefield through binoculars could see that Boer fire from the trenches was slackening, but they interpreted this as the result of effective British artillery suppression rather than the abandonment of positions. When forward British infantry finally reached the Boer trench lines in early afternoon, they found them largely empty except for a few rearguards who fired a few shots and then rode away. The realization spread slowly through the British ranks. The Boers were gone, and had been gone for hours. The responsibility for the escape lay primarily with General French and his cavalry division. French's mission was clear: sweep around the Boer flank and cut the roads leading east, blocking the enemy's line of retreat. His force was more than adequate for this task, outnumbering the entire Boer army and possessing mobility that should have allowed him to reach blocking positions well ahead of any Boer withdrawal. Yet French's advance was inexplicably cautious and slow. His cavalry moved at a walk when they should have been galloping, stopped frequently to maintain formation, and seemed more concerned with parade ground precision than with actually accomplishing their mission. When French's lead elements finally reached the roads east of Poplar Grove, they arrived hours too late. The main Boer force had already passed through, along with their supply wagons and artillery. French's cavalry found themselves facing only Boer rearguards, small groups of mounted riflemen who skirmished briefly and then withdrew. The British cavalrymen, exhausted from their march and under scattered fire, made no serious attempt to pursue or cut off the retreating Boers. They had reached their objective geographically, but had completely failed in their actual mission of cutting off the enemy retreat. The southern flanking column under Kilkenny encountered similar problems, though their issues stemmed more from excessive caution than poor timing. Kilkenny's infantry could see Boer supply wagons moving eastward, tempting targets that should have been intercepted. But Kilkenny, perhaps remembering the disasters that had befallen British forces that advanced too boldly without support, refused to push forward aggressively. His infantry maintained careful formations, advanced methodically, and ultimately arrived at blocking positions long after the Boers had passed safely through. The encirclement that should have trapped 6,000 Boers instead closed on empty farmland. Roberts, watching the operation unfold from his headquarters, was reportedly apoplectic with rage as reports arrived making clear that the Boers were escaping. He sent increasingly urgent orders to French and Kilkenny to push forward, to cut off the retreat, to engage the enemy with any means necessary. But Roberts was miles from the actual fighting, and his orders reached subordinate commanders too late or were interpreted too cautiously. The British command system, built around careful coordination and methodical execution, simply could not react quickly enough to exploit fleeting opportunities against a mobile, adaptive enemy. By nightfall on March 7th, the situation was clear and humiliating. The British had captured Poplar Grove and the surrounding positions at a cost of fewer than 100 casualties. They had executed their flanking maneuver precisely as planned. They had advanced across the battlefield in textbook fashion, and they had accomplished absolutely nothing of strategic value. The Boers had withdrawn intact, taking virtually all their supplies and equipment with them. British troops occupied empty trenches and captured a handful of broken wagons. Not a single significant Boer unit had been destroyed or captured. The immediate tactical statistics made the operation look like a British victory. Ground had been taken, the enemy had retreated, casualties were minimal. But anyone with strategic understanding recognized Poplar Grove as a catastrophic failure of execution. Roberts had assembled overwhelming force and created perfect conditions for decisive victory, and his subordinate commanders had squandered the opportunity through caution, slowness, and lack of aggression. The largest British army in South Africa had been outmaneuvered by a force 1/7 its size. The Boers, for their part, were both relieved and somewhat astonished at their escape. Christian de Wet would later write about Poplar Grove with a mixture of pride in his own decision-making and amazement, that the British had allowed his force to slip away. The withdrawal had been risky. If the British cavalry had moved with even moderate speed, the Boers would have been caught in the open and destroyed. That they escaped was due partly to de Wet's quick thinking and partly to British execution so poor it bordered on incompetence. The political and military ramifications of Poplar Grove were complex. On one level, the battle represented continued British success. Roberts was advancing, the Boers were retreating, and Bloemfontein would fall to British forces just days later. The overall strategic situation favored Britain, and individual operational failures seemed less important given the broader trajectory of the campaign. British newspapers reported Poplar Grove as a victory, emphasizing the capture of Boer positions and the retreat of enemy forces, while glossing over the escape of the entire Boer army. But within military circles, Poplar Grove was recognized as a fiasco that exposed fundamental problems in British command culture. The excessive caution that characterized French's advance reflected a broader reluctance among British officers to take risks or deviate from careful plans. Earlier in the war, excessive boldness and frontal assaults had led to disasters like Magersfontein and Spion Kop, but the pendulum had swung too far in the opposite direction, producing a paralysis of overcaution that was equally dysfunctional. British commanders had been burned so badly by earlier failures that they now hesitated to exploit opportunities even when circumstances were overwhelmingly favorable. The cavalry's performance at Poplar Grove was particularly disappointing and would spark debates about the role and effectiveness of mounted troops that continued for years. British cavalry in 1900 was still organized and trained primarily for shock action, the classic cavalry charge with sabres drawn. But the Boer War was demonstrating that this role was obsolete against enemies armed with modern rifles. The Boers used horses for mobility but fought on foot, a combination that proved far more effective than traditional cavalry tactics. British cavalry at Poplar Grove had the mobility to accomplish their mission but lacked the tactical flexibility and aggressive mindset to exploit it. French himself would go on to command British forces in the First World War, where his performance would be similarly characterized by caution and missed opportunities. The patterns of behavior visible at Poplar Grove, the reluctance to push forward aggressively when circumstances demanded speed, would reappear in France 15 years later with far more catastrophic consequences. Poplar Grove was an early warning sign that the British military system was producing commanders who could plan, operations competently but struggled to execute them with the flexibility and aggression that battlefield success required. For the Boers, the successful withdrawal from Poplar Grove provided a template for the next phase of the war. Christian de Wet would become the master of the fighting retreat, conducting a series of operations over the coming months that frustrated British attempts at decisive victory. His insight was that the Boers did not need to win conventional battles. They merely needed to avoid losing them. By refusing to be pinned down, by withdrawing before encirclement could succeed, by preserving their mobile forces for continued resistance, the Boers could prolong the war indefinitely even as they lost territory and resources. The actual fighting at Poplar Grove, such as it was, illustrated the evolution of Boer tactics. When British forces did engage Boer rearguards, they encountered enemies who fought briefly from cover and then withdrew before British numbers could overwhelm them. The Boers no longer attempted to hold fixed positions against British artillery bombardment. They traded space for time, accepting territorial losses in exchange for preserving their fighting forces. This approach was frustrating for the British, who found themselves advancing continuously but never quite catching the enemy force they were pursuing. The contrast between Poplar Grove and earlier battles like Magersfontein or Spion Kop was stark. In those earlier engagements, Boer forces had fought from prepared positions and inflicted devastating casualties on attacking British troops. But they had also risked encirclement and capture by remaining in fixed locations. At Poplar Grove, the Boers demonstrated that they had learned the lesson of Paardeberg, where Piet Cronjes' decision to stand and fight had resulted in the capture of his entire force. De Wet and his fellow commanders would not make that mistake. Mobility and preservation of force would take precedence over defense of territory. The capture of Bloemfontein on March 13th, just days after Poplar Grove, seemed to validate Roberts' overall strategy despite the operational failure. The capital of the Orange Free State fell without significant resistance, a major political and psychological victory for Britain. But Bloemfontein's capture did not end the war or even significantly weaken Boer resistance. The commando forces that escaped from Poplar Grove would continue fighting for more than 2 years, and Christian de Wet would become one of the most successful guerrilla commanders in military history, conducting raids and ambushes that tied down vastly superior British forces. The ridiculous nature of the Poplar Grove defeat lay not in dramatic reversal or catastrophic casualties, but in the gap between what should have happened and what actually occurred. Everything had been in place for decisive victory: overwhelming numbers, sound planning, favorable terrain, complete initiative. The British had done everything right up until the moment when aggressive execution became necessary. Then the machinery of command had failed, producing hesitation where speed was required and caution where boldness would have won the day. Military historians studying Poplar Grove have identified it as a textbook example of how tactical success can mask operational failure. Every individual British unit accomplished its immediate mission. The artillery suppressed Boer positions effectively. The infantry advanced and captured the enemy trenches. The flanking columns reached their geographic objectives. But the operation's actual purpose, destroying or capturing the Boer force, was completely unfulfilled. It was as if an entire army had perfectly executed a training exercise, while forgetting that real enemies didn't wait around to be captured. The psychological impact on Boer morale was significant and positive. De Wet's force had been in genuine danger of destruction, facing encirclement by overwhelming numbers. Their successful escape demonstrated that intelligent leadership and quick decision-making could overcome even massive material disadvantage. The commandos who withdrew from Poplar Grove carried with them the knowledge that the huge British army, for all its size and equipment, could be outmaneuvered by smaller, more agile forces. This confidence would sustain Boer resistance through the grinding guerrilla war that followed. For British soldiers on the ground, Poplar Grove was a frustrating anticlimax. Men who had marched all day and prepared for major battle found themselves occupying empty positions and watching distant dust clouds as the enemy rode away. There was a sense of having been cheated, of having done everything asked and still accomplishing nothing meaningful. Officers who understood what had happened were privately scathing about the missed opportunity. Though public criticism of superior officers was career suicide in the Victorian military system, the logistics of the operation revealed another dimension of British dysfunction. Moving 40,000 men across the South African veldt required enormous supply trains, thousands of wagons carrying food, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment. These supply columns moved slowly and required protection, constraining the mobility of the entire army. The Boers, by contrast, travelled light, with each commando responsible for its own supplies and able to move at speeds British forces could not match. At Poplar Grove, British logistical superiority became a liability, slowing the army to the pace of its supply wagons while the enemy simply rode away. Roberts attempted to address these mobility issues in subsequent operations, but the fundamental problem remained throughout the conventional phase of the war. British forces were organized for sustained campaigns with regular supply, while Boers operated more like raiding parties, living off the land and maintaining only the logistical tail necessary for ammunition. This difference in operational philosophy meant that even when British planning was sound, execution struggled to keep pace with a more mobile enemy. The media coverage of Poplar Grove in Britain demonstrated the growing sophistication of war reporting and government information management. Initial reports emphasized the capture of Boer positions and the enemy retreat, framing the operation as another step in Roberts' victorious advance. Only gradually did more critical analysis emerge, noting the escape of the Boer army and questioning why such overwhelming force had produced so little concrete result. But by then, the fall of Bloemfontein dominated headlines, and Poplar Grove faded into the background of the larger campaign narrative. In the longer perspective of the Boer War, Poplar Grove marked the transition from conventional operations to guerrilla warfare. The Boers demonstrated that they could not hold territory against British numbers, but could preserve their fighting forces through mobility and quick decision-making. This realization would shape the remainder of the war. As Boer commandos abandoned defense of fixed positions in favor of raids, ambushes, and attacks on British supply lines, the war would drag on for more than 2 years after Poplar Grove, and British frustration at their inability to bring Boer forces to decisive battle would lead to increasingly harsh measures, including farm burning and concentration camps. When we reflect on the Battle of Poplar Grove, more than a century later, its significance lies not in what happened, but in what failed to happen. It stands as a monument to missed opportunity, to the dysfunction that can afflict even the most powerful military organizations. 40,000 British soldiers, led by celebrated commanders and equipped with modern weapons, had been unable to trap 6,000 Boers because the command system could not translate theoretical planning into aggressive execution. The lessons of Poplar Grove should have been obvious. That numerical superiority means nothing without the ability to bring it to bear effectively. That flanking maneuvers require speed and aggression to succeed. That caution can be as dangerous as recklessness when opportunities are fleeting. Some British officers learned these lessons and adapted their tactics accordingly. But the institutional culture that produced the Poplar Grove fiasco persisted and would contribute to similar failures in future conflicts. The most ridiculous British defeat of the Boer War was ridiculous precisely because it looked like a victory in every superficial way. Ground was captured, the enemy retreated, casualties were light, and strategic objectives were subsequently achieved. But the actual purpose of the operation, the destruction of enemy fighting power, was utterly unfulfilled. The Boers walked away from Poplar Grove to fight for 2 more years, and the British walked away having learned nothing about the gap between planning and execution that plagued their military system. Poplar Grove stands as a cautionary tale about the difference between doing things right and doing the right thing. The British did everything right according to their doctrine and training. They planned carefully, coordinated precisely, and advanced methodically. But they failed to do the right thing at the critical moment, which was to abandon caution and pursue aggressively while the opportunity existed. In the gap between textbook execution and practical reality, 6,000 Boers rode to safety and the war continued unabated. That gap, more than any battlefield disaster, revealed the true dysfunction at the heart of British military performance in South Africa.